Hey, welcome everybody to our digital organisation design workshops. This is number 2 in the series. Big thank you again to Multilateral Group, who are taking us through these sessions based on their Exemplar model and all of their experience. Just the housekeeping of you are being recorded. So if you have an issue with being seen or heard now or later, please send an email to jp@lawfidao.com and I will be sure to edit out of the recording the references to you. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands from which we all meet today. I join you again from the Wurundjeri land and want to extend our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So without further ado, I will hand over to Duncan and or Andrew to open us up for today, and really excited. Can't wait to get into this session. So over to you.
I'll give a quick overview of what's in store for the day, Joni, and then we'll get Duncan to lead the next piece. So really looking at breaking down into a couple of different areas today. So first piece is to look at the assignments, the post-workshop assignments that were handed out after last week, which was really breaking down the key assumptions of the model. So opening that up for questions, insights, feedback from the group, and to make any clarifications out of that. The majority of the time today will be spent in terms of member class exploration. So member classes are a key part of the organisational design we've put together. As you'll have seen in the assumptions list, it's what creates the opportunities for all the authorities and delegations, the rights, the obligations, etc., etc. So exploring member classes, how they operate, what they can be, and starting to think about what sorts of member classes at a broad brush level suit the purposes of LawFi DAO, both in terms of thinking at it from a commercialisation type area, but also looking at the non-for-profit component, because as we know, we've got, as it currently stands, we've got a dual purpose for LawFi DAO that runs down those streams, which in themselves create some of our issues around structural oversight and the like, and how we respond to regulators, etc., etc. So we'll do a deep dive on that, and that'll be very much around interaction with participants and getting everybody's feedbacks and comments and thoughts there, and we'll facilitate that as we go. But the concept that we draw out of and where that exploration will inform will be into the workshop assignment for post this workshop, which is really starting to, we'll put together out of today's conversation a template which can effectively start looking at what a member class matrix could look like, and we'll give that to all the participants to put their own thoughts in terms of what sort of insights that they brought from the conversation, what sort of member classes, where do they see obligations, liabilities, benefits, and attributions, and how all that contributes, and that will be the cornerstone of what we go forward with next week. So that's the core layout of what today is about. I don't know whether anybody's got any questions at this stage, or whether you'd like us to just move straight into Duncan facilitating the assumptions. And good afternoon to everybody that's just joined.
Right. With stunned silence for the obligatory 5 seconds, we'll go straight into the assumption list. So Joni did yesterday distribute a document which had a lot of the material we went through in the workshops, or the pictures at least, and then in detail we had a summary, and then a detailed set of assumption lists and possible next steps that might be available to that. Now, a lot of them was around two things. One, what would be needed for an MVP operational state, and how could we handle this? I mean, we are looking at fundamentally, we're looking for a Web3 solution to do this, but from my perspective, there needs to be stepping stones put in place. And the first stepping stone is, what is the bare capability we need for a minimum viable product or minimal viable operational capability? And then maybe what the steps after. So really with the MVP, if you look at a lot of the assumptions, the MVP operationally is more about content than actual automation or digital capability. There is some required. There's a lot of existing systems that would be able to make use of, for example, CRM systems and other things like that, which are easy to get and easy to configure from a subscribe perspective. But there is a lot of, from my perspective, content that needs to be delivered and packaged, particularly around the rights and obligations, the T's and C's, and basically the legal clauses associated with membership and allocation to member classes. So that's my summary of it. Has anyone got any questions from the document that was actually distributed last week, or any comments, feedback, queries?
Hey, Duncan, it's Greg here. So I just got my video. I think George has finished eating lunch now. Yeah, I'm just interested, particularly in one of the areas that was quite interesting to me was the regulatory equivalence section, where you talked about a proof of concept requirement for the bylaw kind of model. Yep. Could you just give us a little more insight into that bit?
Well, I mean, very much. I wrote this before these workshops came out, and I see a proof of concept as actually being proven in the LawFi DAO blueprint. What we'll have there is when we do our member classes and we start looking at the rights and obligations, we'll then be able to categorize how can we establish a contractual agreement in a combination of constitution, shareholders agreement, or standalone agreements associated with member class onboarding, so that you as a member of LawFi DAO and onboarded into two member classes, member class A and member class C, has a contractual obligation which mirrors or means that the regulated body that you're associated to within the LawFi DAO you have the obligations, you have you got a fractionalized liability, and you've got benefits recognized. And the basis of all that is sitting in an agreement suite, which is constructed in steps. The first step is membership. The second and subsequent steps are member class allocations. And then the final step may be in depending on the model, is if we have a service directory, if we have an automated service delivery model, there actually might be terms and conditions associated with that service definition, which are explicit to the service definition. The whole idea being is at the end of I consume or I provide a service, I need behind me in that collection of agreements everything that protects me and protects LawFi DAO and provides regulatory equivalence to the regulated entity we're using to talk to the outside the DAO, basically outside the membership.
Yeah, good. I guess, yeah, because this is the area that really intrigues me, I guess. Because how does the DAO move with the outside the DAO world? Are there models that exist that you've got various options that you can look at and compare to the LawFi DAO experience, or is it almost clean sheet of paper stuff and work through it from there?
No, there are. So there's a couple. The first one that we've relied on most heavily, well, I've relied on most heavily, is the national cooperative legislation. Now, if you look at that, there's a lot of constraints, but the model rule template that is distributed is set up for, there's sort of base regulation which everyone has to deal with, and then there's the options. So if you go through that legislation or the model rule template and then marry it back to the legislation, there's a lot of flexibility both in membership, in types of members, membership processing, membership shares. So cooperatives have both a financial unit called a cooperative capital unit, which can be used for capital raising, and there's rules around that. But there's also rules about shareholding. So another method of capital raising within cooperatives is shares, and they're quite specific in terms of how that works. So in a collaborative, decentral, and if we look at cooperatives in Australia as sort of version 0 of DAOs. You know, they work, they're legislated, and they have that collaborative basis. The other jurisdictions, so there's some stuff happening in Switzerland. So actually, and Grant, who's here with me today, can maybe talk a bit more about that. But certainly we've investigated a number of jurisdictions that are available and that are playing in this space. And there's certainly some stuff coming out of, Andrew, you distributed the Katabra, their planned unregulated associated. There was a so
they're coming from a special economic zone type basis and a digital special economic zone construct, and we know the guys behind and have worked with the people that have put that together over the last number of years, and they've just in the last couple of weeks noted that they have they can now register a DAO in the Catawba Special Economic Zone. So we'll see how that evolves. They're doing 2 models. One is a non-for-profit and one is based on an LLC type construct. So, but it's still work in progress, but it's certainly another step forward jurisdictionally at a global level.
But very much the basis of our model is we know this stuff's coming and we don't want to wait for it. In fact, we want to set up the bylaws and the rules to operate, and then have an adapter. Basically, the process is create the DAO with bylaws. As you see, they'll be required by a future regulation or regulatory environment, and then but also add to that adapter to an existing regulated entity, which is basically the response we got back. LawFi got back from ASIC early on, which is, well, how can you do this without adding a new regulatory body?
Find a way.
So it is, and this is where operationally I look at it and I say it's a building blocks. If you think about the other way around, the equivalence I look at, and I've talked to this, so other examples. I come originally from South Australia, and they introduced what was called the e-projects procurement. So you got onto a panel. There was 10 categories. You nominated how many categories you put your hand up for. So the deed was 256 pages, but the deed covered 10 categories. Now we put up our hand and were successful in getting 4 categories. So if you actually looked at our obligations and rights, it was a subset of that 256 pages. There was the stuff that was applicable to everyone, and then there was the stuff that were applicable to us, because we got the nod for those categories. I'm wanting to use that sort of mentality. Everyone has to sign up to the membership bylaws. If you're a member, this is what you've got to do. And it's only those special cases. It's then, what do we do? This is the importance of the member class. Okay, if we're a contributor to the pay to rely model, what additional obligations and rights do we get assigned? So it's the proof of concept is, can we set a contractual structure using whatever individual components we get to load up the obligations and rights of an individual or an individual stakeholder or an individual member within LawFi DAO, and have that providing the confidence to everyone dealing with the regulated entities, that there is actually line of sight between the regulated entities and the individual members who are contributing or are within the footprint of that regulated entity's activities.
Cool. Thanks.
So I do tend to waffle. I do apologise.
Well, and I just want to point out, Vic has made some great comments in the chat. I don't know if you're in a position to speak, but if you can, that would be great if you could share any of your insights.
Yeah,
And,
hey guys.
and then we'll go to Miles with your hand up too. Sorry, I just saw your hand up.
No video today. I'm saving everybody that pleasure. But on the market insights, I'm just, very lucky to have the opportunity to do a big market analysis piece on where DAO laws are, where they're progressing. The jurisdictions that I assessed were not all jurisdictions in which DAOs have legal personality. So Marshall Islands was excluded, and a couple of other ones for obvious reasons that it was just not going to work for the particular client in relation to their activity. So US excluded as well. One of the really interesting insights was the World Fraud and Path, which is the Caymans Foundation set up with a BVI service code. That used to be the preeminent model. There was a lot of hilarity around the competitiveness between Caymans and Switzerland for their foundation models. I heard on a number of occasions, don't work with the Swiss. It doesn't work. It's expensive. Swiss lawyers are annoying and, don't know how to think creatively. So there was a lot of Swiss bashing. There is a big movement from Cayman and BVI model into the UAE. And if you didn't see, there were some laws that were dropped on the 7th of this month, so a couple of days ago, in relation to VARA, Virtual Asset Reg Authority's new regulatory framework for everyone from issuers through to custodians, advisors, and everyone in the fora. So, quote unquote, some of the clients that the Caymans lawyers would never have seen move anywhere outside of the Caymans a couple of years ago, and now making their way to the UAE. So I think it definitely needs to be something that we keep in our sights. I am about as bullish on Dubai as they come, but I think it's important to keep an eye on other jurisdictions that are, really making a play for this market. So Singapore was on my list. Hang on, let me just go through that. I'm running just off the top of my head. I'm not on documents right now. So we looked at Singapore, Switzerland, Cayman, BVI, Dubai, UAE, and an outlier, Norway. And the UAE, just in a broader brushstroke. So there's some fun insights there, and very happy to delve into the granularity and hand over some contacts if we ever want to actually go through the activity or do the cost estimates for an activity in each of those jurisdictions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Vic. And Miles, you've put your hand down. Is that addressed by what Vic said, or you still wanted to offer a comment?
Sorry, rule me out of order if it takes you too tangentially away from where we're headed. But just on two things. One, on contracts. Usually with contracts with a member has a contract with each other member, and then a member has a contract with the entity, the legal entity. So you have a web of contracts. And then the beauty of company law is that company law says that the Constitution is a contract. So you don't have to change the master contract every time somebody comes on and joins or somebody else leaves. Because if you have just a normal contract, you've got to change the contract every time somebody comes on or somebody leaves, which is administratively difficult. So I wondered if you considered that problem, because that's overcome in company law by a statutory contract. And the second thing which came to me when I was thinking about this in the wee hours of the morning, but it was mentioned about the pay to rely. Is it possible for you, I can see this would solve a lot of problems, if it was possible for you to conceptualize the pay to rely as a platform which was owned by the non-profit for its members, but the use of the platform was a separate enterprise. So people individually contracted with the platform and whoever was behind it to put documents there and yada yada yada, the return or use of it. So yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
You know, you raise good points, and just to pick up on a couple of those themes and the framework that Duncan has laid out for us. What we might be moving towards is the death of the entity. And what DAOs provide us with is a framework for communities, not for organizations, and fluid communities. So when you're building open source, what we build in LawFi DAO might also be applicable to the medical profession in the way that they want to release certain things that the public might want to rely on. And so this is future casting, but it's to set the context around all of these small steps that we are taking, is to say, if we are actually dealing with the death of the entity form or that container of an organization, in law and as trained lawyers, a lot of us on this call, we are used to segmenting particular activities in entities. So Miles, what you're talking about of a foundation or a not-for-profit entity to do one set of functions and a for-profit entity to do other functions, what the Exemplar model, or I understand of it, you know, in those materials where you can see an organization chart, it might be head of compliance, head of marketing, you know, pick your area of responsibility. But what it forces us to do is distill the functions of that activity or that go under that responsibility. And by fractionalizing our contributions, the contributions not just benefit the community, so the LawFi DAO community and the Pay-to-Rely protocol and efforts that we're working on now, but that fractionalized effort then can take us further in different and composable applications. And what we want to be able to do is have some form of legal personhood and limited liability of a DAO, including many different functions that we typically would have structured across many entities, including, you know, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Marshall Islands. You know, you might have many entities in many jurisdictions to serve those compliance purposes. And as I understand from this Exemplar model, some of the functions or activities might be regulated, others might be effectively unregulated. And it's because we don't have directors and officers that are ultimately responsible for the streams of functions in the entity container, in that future casting policy environment, as I advocate for limited liability of the DAO form, part of that discussion is, if you grant the privilege of limited liability, that's got to come with things like directors' duties. But in this case, if we don't have directors with the oversight and responsibility of all functions across a community, we have to replace it. And Chris Ray, who writes a lot on this topic, he gave me a very useful frame of reference this morning, that it's more about a duty to faithfully implement processes that have had regard to security, had regard to consumer outcomes. And so this is a framework that maybe our existing laws and analogies to existing charitable foundations, or the way that we structure multi-purpose enterprises, but it's not a direct analogy. And I'm probably not making sense, but I just am trying to tie in all of the different themes, and we do have to work with the existing legal frameworks that we have now, but also preserve the experimental freedom of what is possible as perhaps we're seeing the death of the entity.
Yeah. So,
Joni, I think you are. I'm going to time check here, but I'm going to use what you just said, which does make sense as a segue to this next section in terms of take what you just said, think about that faithfully implementing processes, apply this ability to bring in the member class, which is not an entity in itself, but it's certainly a container of rights, obligations, benefits, and attributions, and then start thinking about how that, when it interacts with all the other member classes in the outside world, how do those elements work together, and how do they make a more effective process that does have a degree of functionality and certainly addresses issues that are in the community at the moment. So,
just one comment on that. I'll be brief. What you're proposing is a huge complex of contractual relations, which is so huge and interrelated and so fast moving that it may well meet its demise under its own weight of confusion and complexity. The other thing that I just point to is that organizations which are communities and doing this do exist, and they're mainly in faith-based communities. And again, I'll go back to what I said last time. They work on a consensual compact, not contracts. And a consensual compact will withstand the complexity of relationships without formal contracting. So, just.
Oh, very much so. This is the response here, and Andrew, Joni, and Miles. It's embrace the complex. We are stepping away from a structural separation, providing some resemblance or perception of simplicity. It isn't. It's just the perception of simplicity, and we're actually embracing it. Miles, see, I disagree. I've looked after many complex systems. And I've seen it fail miserably. I agree. There is a lot of history of simple, but if you embrace it, if you actually go into it, which we are going into our eyes open, what you've just said, which is great complex of contracts, the answer there is, well, it has to be held by a system. We can't be relying on documents. We can't be relying on having to open up a physical contract to read the T's and C's to understand what our obligations are. We are talking about smart systems actually presenting you and keeping a track of your personal obligations at any particular time is presented to you in a summary, so you are aware of what they are. So yes, I mean, there are some of the sort of, I think, extrapolations of going forward. We are certainly heading towards complex systems, but in doing so, let's be aware of that and say, okay, if we are embracing the complex, what tool sets do we need? What capabilities do we need for the humans to have confidence that they know what they're getting, what they're signing up for? So I look at it and say, embrace the complex, but we'll deal with it with some smart design, not smart system. Hopefully, maybe some smart systems at the end of it, but smart design. Right, Andrew, please move us on.
We're moving into the area of exploring member classes, Duncan. And I guess the place to start here is to look at our purpose footprint. And down the track, what this whole exercise over the 3 weeks of workshops will do, one of the things that will come out of the blueprint will be a revision of and really pressure testing our purpose to crystallize it into exactly where it's going. So it's there for pushing around, pushing, prodding, looking at how we do that and how we deliver it in its form. So as a starting point, what are the sorts of interactions that a member that is either, let's say at the moment, operating in a pay-to-rely piece, or that same person, as Duncan said earlier, you can be a part of more than one member class. You're now working over into an education and policy formation type influence as well. So what are some of those interactions? What are the broad brush member classes that start to enable that to happen?
Don't all go
Crowd's
for it
gone
once at
wild,
once.
Duncan. Yeah, the crowd's gone wild.
I'm happy to kick everybody off. And it's not necessarily the correct lens to look at this, but in the draft white paper for LawFi DAO, they're not so much member classes, but there's different types of tokens proposed. And so this might not be the correct lens in which to define the member classes, but there is the money token to reflect the money that has been contributed to the DAO, or the value that the DAO has given to its core contributors, such as through token rewards. The time token to recognize the time that each person has contributed. And whilst not in the draft white paper, if we attach the particular functions that a contributor has completed or is responsible for in association with that time, you get a very rich time token or a time or a contributor member class. There's the pay to rely products. So however many providers are wanting to launch and deploy those pay to rely products, that's another form of token suite because it may involve a number of NFTs. And I mean, there's various other tokens that we could think about, like such as a liquidity providing token or further staking arrangements to have a vote, to trigger your voting powers. So I just put that out there. I'm not necessarily wedded to those as the member classes, but just to get the discussion going.
Yeah. So one of the things, and it's like, unfortunately, this comment is going to be wait till next week. We have talked a lot about the DAS, and we actually see the DAS environment, the DAS, our DAS, the attribution allocation model, actually providing a solution to simplify the token activity, because a lot of what you were talking about is actually benefit or / liability in an event. So if we have a generic version or a reusable set of algorithms with configuration changes that can process different value, either as a benefit or as a liability, depending on a defined rule set, a lot of the nuances you're looking for that you had to separate tokens is solved for. I think going back, but it is a good place to start for, because what you're talking about is we want to separate rights and obligations. So if you are a contributor of money, so let's look at, we've got Joni, she's a contributor of money. We've got me, I just want to poke my nose in and see what's happening. We've got Andrew, who wishes to be a provider, and we've got William. They're just the four people who are the first on my Zoom link, and we've got William, who wants to be a consumer or wants to be educating. What we've got to look at is what's the shared rights and obligations of memberships? What would we all be happy to sign up to? And then what are the required rights and obligations for us fulfilling that additional role on top of base membership? So I'm a base membership person. I'm not interested in benefit, and I'm not interested in liability. So really the only obligations I've got is to maintain, I would propose, if we're sort of doing an equivalence to a cooperative law, I've got to maintain my participation. I've got to show that I'm actually fulfilling the participation obligations of being a base member. So that's the default state. Joni was a money contributor. Okay, so what rights and obligations should she have uniquely on top of the base membership profile? Anyone? You want the money paid back, Joni?
Well, this is the really core thing, because if I'm happy to give a donation, I want to know that it's a donation and possibly get the tax deduction around it.
Right.
But if I have an allocation of money for which I want to have a return on investment, then my criteria is just knowing up front. And as Miles has pointed out, it's sort of sacrosanct that, especially with the not-for-profit purpose, it would be a harmful practice, and it would reduce my trust in DAOs if I did make a donation and then subsequently it turned into a for-profit and I couldn't participate in the return on investment. So I think it's more just clarity and commitment to that clarity. But I struggle in saying that because I do think that DAOs need the room to evolve. So yeah, but I'm seeing it in parent DAOs and sub DAOs, and whether the parent DAO, when a sub DAO breaks off, whether the parent DAO should be entitled to a token allocation from the sub DAO. And I think that almost strikes the right balance to give freedom to spin something out that does, or has been identified to have a commercial place in the world. And in the DAO context, it might not be spun out of a separate entity, but we still want to be able to distinguish between the right or wrongfulness of receiving a return of investment versus not.
So one of the things I've heard in here is, in terms of straight rights and obligations, is access to information. So we're looking for, we wish to have a right, if we're contributing money, then one of the rights we want to provide those members is the right to transparent operational data. So you want to know, you want to have access to a dashboard which reliably provides you with key indicators associated with your money contribution, money donation, it's being spent in the right place, or your investment. So now that I'd say, is that a right on top of a basic member? As a basic member, I haven't contributed any money, I've just jumped on board. Would I have the same right to that information?
I mean, this is just an outsider's view, but you know, I take your point, Duncan, about information, but I think there's a difference between people with a financial interest and people without a financial interest. And that is, I think, generally speaking, without any expectation of a return on the investment, the actual benefit you get by putting money in is choosing how that money is spent. Now, right. I guess there's an issue here about when you put money in, whether you want to allow other people to decide and influence how it's decided to spend, or whether it's maybe a threshold for the expenditure. So maybe people who have contributed money have more say over how that money's spent, or only have the say, or for items that are significant, or entering a contract or whatever else. So I guess I'm a member of the MCC, right? Sporting, stuff, and there are tiers of membership, and it's to manage access to seats, but there's also voting differences, access to different matches and whatever else. And there's also ring-fenced or grandfathered benefits of members as the constitution's changed over time. So there are people who have been members for 40 years that have still got visitors tickets. Now the current members can't access a visitor's ticket. There's no concept of a visitor's ticket. So the reason I'm saying that is it's sort of, with that as a parallel, it seems like it doesn't have to be about sharing in a profit, because as a member of the MCC, I don't get any benefit, financial, whatever else, but I do.
Well, your
goes on the board.
Your benefits turning up, isn't it?
Right. So I'm a voting member as opposed to a non-voting member. So I can vote the executive and who goes on the board. I can, I can access the grand final, whereas restricted members can't go to the grand final. I can go to the Boxing Day test, and I can do this. So I don't think it's just about profitability. I think it's about the type of decisions and just recognizing where people would feel it was reasonable that someone had made an investment. Now the question is, if you make a $1 investment, is that the same as someone who's made $1 million investment? You know, and now once again, there's all sorts of stuff from mutuals versus this versus that, which is one person, one vote versus shareholding proportional stuff. And I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying.
See, there's a bit of from a true collaborative in I'd say that everyone should have access to the information, because we're a DAO. We're looking for the democratic look. So I mean, I'm asking questions to get these conversations going. So my response to it would be, no, I think everyone should get all the information published by the DAO should be available to all members, unless there is some contractual, you know, a external DAO constraint on providing information because of, you know, commercial and confidence issues or other issues.
To follow on from that, are we actually starting to get distinguish between owners and users, which is starting to actually, this is for the community, by the community, people putting money in on the expectation of return? I get that there's got to be some sort of funding arrangement, but to me, the real power here is that the community owns it. So the benefits flow back to the community who actually use it. So perhaps if we could get their membership sorted out, we can work out around that what other types of membership you might need once we work out the benefits and the requirements for the users. So
can we distinguish? Can we call the users consumers, please? Because all the part of the community, both providers of services and consumers of services, are part of the community. And actually, a provider of a service can be a consumer of the service as well, with different hats on. So take your point. I think it's a good point. Who are the consumers of the pay-to-rely model? Are they members? First of all, I've got a question. Are they members of the DAO?
This is such a controversial question.
Do they have to be members of the DAO? Let me reframe it. Do they have to?
What does a member mean?
What was that, Greg?
What does a member mean, though, there, or on that basis?
Well, it's a loaded term that's been inherited from companies, and like you've said, we're moving outside of that when we're talking about communities, and I have been using the word stakeholder or participant in the community. And so it's almost like stakeholder classes or participant classes. And the point that Duncan makes around consumers, you know, should you only have rights or benefits or liabilities in relation, well, with respect to your relationship with the DAO, if you're consuming some aspect of it. So it's more than a mere stakeholder observer, for example.
But then you could add another layer of complexity to that, Joni, and you could be a consumer, and let's use pay-to-rely as the example here. You could be a consumer of a pay-to-rely product, but you may also have market feedback as that consumer to improve that product, and to make a better product for the broader community. So once we start moving into this dynamic attribution and allocation system conversation we'll have next week, what rights do you have as a consumer in that context of you providing your feedback? Where do you get recognised for the feedback that you've given? And how can you be recognised, and how can that be built into the model system?
I'll offer a response and then open it up to everybody. But this is, by me as Bedazzle, relying on the open source, you know, pay-to-rely protocol to deliver pay-to-rely products. What rights I would wish to have seem to be as against the DAO. Now, I don't want to sue the DAO necessarily, but I want to look at who was the responsible person or persons for the faithful implementation of the pay to rely protocol. And it's not just a set and forget protocol. I would want to have first a rights to complain or to talk to those responsible persons or whoever the replacement governance committee or oversight committee is of the protocol, and say, I'm experiencing this sort of bug or these sorts of issues. Please help, or please help me mitigate my losses. And if I can't, then that's where the insurance part of the protocol came in, where I would expect to have a right to claim against the funds that are reserved in the insurance pool, if it's available.
That's right. So what we're talking about here is non-conformance. Let's use the term of non-conformance as you as someone who is relying on a prescribed scope and specification of the pay to rely service, because that's what it is. Basically, you're putting your hand up and saying this does not conform. It's either it is non-compliant or there's a latent defect in it. Now, you know, I got lawyers in the room. You'll know what latent defects. It's a horrible thing, latent defects. It keeps me up at nights. But so that, I think that's a really good example of, okay, here we go. We have a use case here that we need to go back and be able to answer and make sure that underlying we have all the relationships get back. So that for this particular pay to rely product, who's had these contributors and these endorsers have been there is the DAO is the first level, and the governance mechanisms we've set up in the DAO. But beyond that, we actually have on record via the fractionalized liability concepts, you know, we actually go back to the individual members who have contributed to this pay to rely product. So one member class is definitely a contributor to the product because there's going to be a lot of more rights and obligations. So one member class is definitely product contributor. So product contributor in subject matters, and then there's the people who actually actively on sell or make use of the, you know, is that when your description there in the use case, Joni, is you as Bedazzle is making use of that as a service or a value add to your corporation, you're a member of it and you're making use of it and saying, here, you can rely on this because look. So that, you know, there's two member classes there. There's the contributor to the content, and then there's you who's chosen to on sell or make use of the content.
But this is where it gets really blurry, because a typical software provider that releases software through a company would have an end user license agreement. And if Bedazzle subscribes for that software license, then I'm using that software as a customer and according to that contract. And so by virtue of, this is why when you look at it as a DAO, I'm not a typical member in traditional parlance. I'm actually a customer, but now customers in theory should have some level of say or voting rights, or enhanced ability to engage with, let's call it the internal management of both the protocol. And that's the bridge that we're dividing here, bringing it all into the one community rather than separating it with a customer.
But once again, I don't see an issue with that. That's a member class. Our separation is you are a member and you're a member of several separate member classes. The collection of member classes you're associated with provides all those rights. And one of the things we've got to be able to do, and we've actually talked about this is a sort of a model concept which came out of last week in subsequent discussions with Joni. And I hate to use the word profile, but it's the best description. Within a DAO, which has a membership and many, many member classes, at any particular time, you need to have a profile. So I am when I'm interacting with the DAO, when Joni's interacting with the DAO, with LawFi DAO as Bedazzle, as a consumer, she has a DAO profile on, she has a set of obligations and rights which are specific to that subset of her obligations and rights within the DAO. If she steps back from that and then steps back into I'm a contributor to a pay to rely piece of content, that's a different DAO profile. It's a different membership profile. Her combination of membership and member classes. So that's something I've named it profile for the moment. It's just I don't want to name it profile because everyone's sick and tired of profiles. I don't know about you, but I'm sick and tired of profiles at the moment. But there you go. So I think to answer your question, Johnny, I think we have to actually very much up front and center deal with that very what hat are you wearing at any particular time? We need to be able to evidence that and to make our separations, to deal with the conflict of different regulatory requirements placed on us, whether we're for-profit, not-for-profit, or charitable. We've got to be able to show that any particular time when I'm interacting with the DAO, and I'm interacting with the DAO for charitable effort, that the only access I have under that profile is to information, assets, and capabilities which are prescribed by the charitable constraints. So we have, instead of separation by structure, the charitable is fine because it's a standalone structure. No, we've got standalone profiles which constrain ourselves to the rights and obligations of a charitable environment. And whenever we do work for that charitable environment, we've got those constraints on. We've got that particular jacket on. Right,
yeah, but the question, I would love to hear from at least 3 or 4 people on this point. Andrew, you tell us if we're running out of time, but I'm going to start picking on people.
We've got plenty of time for this one, Joni. It's a contentious issue. It's a very big and broad and meaty topic. We're really in the pioneering space here, so it deserves time and we need input.
Yeah, Miles, go straight to you.
Yeah, what comes to mind is two female academics from the US, Blair and Stout, proposed at the time a revolutionary corporate theory. And so the business corporation America doesn't consist of shareholders, directors, and customers. What we were really looking at was an enterprise, in fact, a team. And they called their theory team production. And they said all members of the team, be you a worker, a supplier, a customer, somebody in accounts, somebody in middle management, all had to work together to achieve the aim of the corporation. And then they investigated how you got all the different parties to cooperate. So you could have a web of complex contracts in the style of The Economist, or you could have a mediating hierarchy which constantly changed the rewards and the incentives for each party to contribute in order to get to the end result. And I think one of the things that they bring to this conversation is that you can't just stand still and just have one algorithm or contracted set of rights and obligations. They've got to change constantly as the external environment and internal environment changes. So it's got to be very fluid. And it's all a matter of transaction costs, which DAOs are concerned with because DeFi can blitz the transaction costs. But every time you add a layer of complexity of contracts, unless they're somehow rendered into code, which is automatically self-adjusting, it's another transaction cost. So I guess the mediating hierarchy instead of the board of directors or senior management here is the democracy of the whole community of the DAO. So yeah, I'm quite happy to send people they wrote a couple of seminal articles, and you can have a look at the team production, because I think that provides an insight about how you reconceptualize business enterprise outside merely shareholders, directors, and customers. It takes it above mere stakeholders to team partners to get the job done, and I think it applies to both for-profits, non-profits, and particularly mutuals, where you need an activity test of a general member to be involved. So the mutual conception of how we deal with it is very important.
Can I just throw a question back to you, Miles, before I go to others, with a very simple example that if I have contributed $10,000 to the DAO as an investor, and I do respect a return on investment, but then Will comes along and he is a producer, a pay-to-rely issuer, let's call it, and Will's earned $100,000 based on his use of the protocol, and so it's become something that his business really relies on. And so Will as one member class and me as another member class, if our interests are somehow different in what we want the DAO's resources to be prioritized, so let's say there's a vote on how the budget is allocated for 2024, who should have more voting weight?
Yeah, and that was the issue, that one of the issues that Blair and Stout dealt with. How do you, often these are conflicting and competing issues, and how do you prioritize them in order to get to the purpose? How do you, and you mediate and compromise that? And they said that the board of directors and senior managers did that. So in DAOs, going by that theory, it would be the community that needs to mediate and manage that, unless you can render it into code in some way to mediate and compromise that so that all is happy. I mean, Blair Stout said it was the board of directors' trick was to just give everybody enough reward to make them happy to keep still in the team, not to exit the team. And it goes much further than that, but that's basically it. So it is entirely conceivable that a lender will have different rights to a donor, will have different rights to a resource using consumer or end user, and clearly they would all be dealt with different expectations by some contractual overlay or relational overlay. But you've got to be clear that a gift is not a loan, and a loan is not a gift. And you can't switch between the two. You may switch from one to the other, but you can't switch between the two very easily.
Eddie OB didn't think so.
Yeah, well, lots didn't. Yeah, that's when you get in trouble. I mean, and then the other thing about classes is company law is full of oppressive conduct, fair treatment of classes, fiduciary relationships of classes. And so when classes conflict or their interests conflict, what do you prioritize? What do you supervise incentivize in terms of team production theory to keep them in the game? That's another issue that will have to be addressed if this thing's going to work.
So I was going to interrupt you before, and I kind of realized it wasn't helpful, but it was never helpful, is it? But I realized that it wasn't helpful in the moment. But the complexity that you were talking about before, Miles, I think we're in danger of just making things more complex to solve some of the issues that are coming up. So for example, the whole, what's the difference between votes of someone who might have a different vested interest in terms of an individual personal interest rather than a community interest. And so like half of me was thinking, well, surely we can recognize where an individual interest might influence. And let's face it, part of the reason people invest or want to do something is because they want to advance an individual interest, right? And they want to protect that. So when we recognize that they're doing it for that purpose, that's what the whole point of limiting someone's voting right is. And in an extreme example of that, my understanding on the blockchain stuff is that there's this whole theoretical issue where one person controls more than half of the tokens, then all of a sudden they can control the whole blockchain. And you know, I think a similar kind of thing here applies here, which is that the design needs to be such that you want to limit, you know, you want to maintain the community, the strength of the community. You want to design the contribution and the reward to kind of make it sustainable. But once again, the more we talk about the problems, all the solutions to me seem like adding layers of complexity to separate things, which I don't think is going to lend it to something that's flexibly sustainable over time, because it seems to me just intuitively you'd need a lot of maintenance of that over time. And that's not what we want to do with this decentralized organization.
Yep. And so churches which are consensual compacts usually have an authority figure, a pope or a bishop or a whatever, and they make the decision and everybody moves on in collegial style. But that's not how it works with a DAO. The community has got to make that decision, and it's got to make that decision pretty quickly and fully informed. And yeah, I'll be interested to see how you support that and resource that to actually happen.
Great. Well, I'm going to now pick on Greg. I don't know if you're in a position to speak, but from what you're seeing with a number of the NFT projects who have also subsequently launched governance tokens and voting rights, and so there's a claiming process where those that held the NFT class were able to now have a first right of claim, so to speak, on the governance tokens. Are you seeing any sort of tensions play out between governance token holders versus the NFTs, and differences in where they want the community to go? Or other comments? Don't let me stifle you.
Yeah, if I do drop out, my battery's on 4%. I'm still not home. I'm stuck in traffic. So apologies if I just suddenly fall off the face of the earth. I haven't had a crash, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a percentage going around that it's like not much more than 15%, I think, of total sort of holders of that token even vote on things, particularly I think in the NFT market. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I think at this point in the market with the NFT like market in general, the only ones that have sort of stuck around are more sort of just speculating anyway. So I would say the number one criteria of most projects that issue a token is like, what's going to be the price and how quickly am I going to dump it? If I know that sounds a bit cynical, but it's just a reality at the moment, at least in the NFT market. So I don't know if there's any, you know, if you like ApeCoin's probably the one that you would use as an example. And is there angst or whatnot between, say, a traditional Bored Ape holder or a Mutant Ape holder versus someone that just holds ApeCoin? There's been like a couple of little spats, you know, I think on some certain votes and things like that. But ultimately, it's a pretty small subset of the community. If you've got sort of, I think there's about 6,000 ape holders out of the 10,000 collection, and I don't know what mutants are sitting out of the 20,000, but yeah, you're only getting a very small percentage that are voting, and then you're getting an even less percentage of actually putting proposals to the ApeCoin sort of DAO for certain things. So yeah, I mean it's I don't know, like that doesn't probably answer your question, Joni. That probably sounds a bit doomy and gloomy, but that's just sort of my knee-jerk reaction to your question there, just in terms of those tokens.
No, it's very insightful. Thank you, Greg. And I see that Vic's put her hand up. Are you in a position to speak still?
Yeah, I just wanted to add or reiterate, I think that keeping it simple is really important. Human psychology means that, you will vote for something where there's self-interest. Voter, what is it called? Voter
apathy.
Yeah, voter apathy, voter exhaustion, where like on one side of the coin, you want voter engagement and membership engagement. And if you bombard members with information or decisions that, don't really produce an immediate incentive or payoff, then you run the risk of the counter side of the coin, which is voters becoming disengaged. I think maybe there's some lessons to be learned in what's happening with the Uniswap V3 proposal on BSC, and how Anderson Horowitz voted no and has like the collective upper hand in terms of voting numbers, and everyone else came in and voted yes because they're like, pardon the French, fuck off. We don't like the fact that you've like declined this. So there's far more complexity in terms of like membership voting and membership psychology, engagement, disengagement. There's a lot there. So I think keeping something really simple, keeping proposals limited to things that, members can really understand clearly, and keeping it to things that incentivize them to continue to vote is important.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And Electra, I'm going to call on you now for some insights, if any, on the Bitcoin ecosystem. Obviously, it hasn't had any DAOs, as far as I'm aware of, build on top of it, but we're starting to see NFTs now. And I still treat the underlying Bitcoin network as included in the definition of a DAO. But, oh, forgive me. All right, well, I'll come back to you. And the next person I'm going to pick on is Alana, if you're in a position to speak. There you are.
Sorry about that.
You're right.
Oh, look, you can see on everyone's screen on face this way. So apologies, I just had to leave for a few minutes there, but is there a specific question that I can?
Yeah, we're just testing, if there are different member classes in a DAO, how should we go about judging which class gets more rights than others in terms of voting weight? And also whether there needs to be a more fluid and dynamic intermediate model which is able to change the voting weight. So the example is in the LawFi DAO context, the investor member class, and I'm an investor, I've put in $10,000. Will is a pay to rely product issuer, and he's earned $100,000 with using the protocol and has come to rely on it, but needs the protocol to be upgraded for either a security flaw or a bug. But he doesn't have enough voting weight to get a proposal through. And that's just one of the context in the LawFi DAO, but it's just trying to draw out, given the different and the conflicting interests of a complex organization, and we're bringing in multiple different stakeholders now, whereas customers like Will in the past, they would not have any voting weight to make a software delivery company update their software, but perhaps as a customer they could put in a complaint and threaten to various regulators that there was as Duncan puts it, a latent defect or a flaw that they're obliged to deal with him quickly. So we're just balancing the difference in relationships in a DAO and how those priorities might map through voting weight.
Well, my instinct is to look at LawFi DAO specifically when we're thinking about this question. And I mean, personally, I would think it would really depend on the kind of role or services that member, as we've talked about, would bring. So thinking LawFi DAO, I mean, would we have a member category for law students, let's say? So people who might be lawyers in the future, so they can't actually provide legal advice and provide those kind of potential resources to the community, but they want to be involved, they want to participate, but perhaps take more of a kind of a sideline approach. So how would, so I guess if we think about, well, who could these members be within the LawFi DAO context specifically, being a law-oriented DAO, what is that? What could that look like? and who are those members from the legal community that we might want to involve that, you know, yeah, other than lawyers.
Well, I actually love that you've raised this, because in one of the preparatory sessions with Duncan and Grant and Andrew and Will, you know, following from that example that I gave last week about the impressionists, I actually said, can we have an impressionist member category where, you know, they're not necessarily concerned with voting or with being a pay-to-rely product issuer, but they want to be part of the community and they want to express their view. And they are, in a sense, immemorializing the sentiment around the things that we're doing and talking and building and how we're governing and managing ourselves. And that's not necessarily captured in existing organization structures. And I would love for that to be one of our membership classes, and I'll put a proposal forward for it to be called the
Johnny,
Impressionist
I think
Club.
what you're describing.
Sorry, just to add on that, on what Jenny was saying, that also I thought of, well, the student category is a good one to think about, because they won't always be students. So they will also evolve in terms of what they could offer, what they could contribute to the DAO in the future. So like we were talking about earlier, it's, yeah, you know, if they're not set in stone forever in terms of what they offer, how can we be more fluid in that way with our member categories?
Love it. Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say what that says to me, and thanks for bringing that up, Alana, is really we're embedding a succession plan from the get-go that can be across any number of disciplines, and it's creating, on one level, it's a piece of participation, and on another level, it's broadening the community. But it is also starting to empower people for the future as well, and to learn in an environment from more experienced people. I think it's a really good idea.
Is there any value, though? Like, we seem to be talking a lot about exceptions almost, and what might happen and other alternatives. Should we maybe try and hone in and at least deal with one or two or classes and get them sorted out? Like, because you probably need some sort of coordinating, governing body, right? Overseeing it, like a foundation did. And you probably have a consumer base, right? Is that the sort of model we're heading towards or thinking about, and therefore we should start talking around that, or is that not even on the table? We should be like, what's the core member groups, and then we can start to fit investors around it, students around it, and talk about succession plans around it. Is there a core group we should be focusing on, starting to put some sort of skeleton idea around that can change as we evolve, and probably keep changing forever, possibly, but I'm not sure we're finding potential problems, and not sort of, I don't feel like necessarily we're starting to lock anything down here.
Yeah, it's a good point. All I'd say to that is, when we're thinking about classes, some of the talk bubbling up is onto Vic's voter apathy point, that you don't want the whole community voting on everything or required to vote on everything. And what is perhaps a better model is domain experts either being appointed or elected in order to make decisions on behalf of the community. So if that is something that the LawFi DAO membership would like to see, then I think that it becomes almost the elected member class, and maybe even subclasses for the particular areas of domain expertise that we need to see for each function of our MVP DAO, not necessarily our visionary DAO. So I like to come back to the core, and in saying that, I think there's got to be the governance class, member class. We've got to have the customer class, for want of a better word, you know, those pay to rely product issuers. We've got to have investor class, but I'm still blurry on whether that needs to be for financial return or donors. So the impressionist class, I think, is important to get community sentiment along the way. Those are the ones that come to mind immediately, but I'll be doing some reflecting after this too, Greg. And you raise a good question, like what are the core member classes versus what are the nice to haves for this particular phase?
Although I noticed Miles had something of a reaction. I don't know whether there was a fly buzzing around, but
yeah, no, hand up. Go. I didn't see your hand. Forgive me, Miles. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. I just want to make a comment about expert groups, and that is that again and again I found that the importance of a generalist in decision-making bodies, and I give the example of the Ford Pinto case, and that is there was an error, engineering error in when they manufactured Ford Pintos in the petrol tank in the back of the car. So when it had a rear ender, 1 out of every 200 times it would burst into flames and possibly incinerate those inside. So the engineers who formed the risk assessment for that Ford Pinto worked out how many times that it would possibly occur using their slide rules and computers, and then worked out the average compensation for paying the families off for incinerated passengers, and worked out it was cheaper not to recall the car and just pay out the compensation than recalling the car, fixing it up, which would have cost Ford more. If you'd had an ordinary human being rather than an engineer on the expert panel, you may well have come to a different decision. So I just put that out there.
I want to jump in, and I've been held back by Grant, so you can thank him. I'm going to put a cat amongst the pigeons. Why do we have voting rights associated with class? Why don't you have voting rights based on contribution? Now, there might be some classes where you cannot get voting rights, like a student class where you're prohibited from doing it. But one of the solutions to your voting rights is a contribution voting rights. And then we can do a matrix that says investment contribution of this much is equal to content contribution of this much. And you both get the vote the same thing. So everyone can actually see from a community perspective where we say our equivalence is, that yes, we actually value contribution as well, as much as we value funding, because look at the contribution. Now, it doesn't have to be like that, but I'm just saying sometimes yes, we are posing questions to you, but I do have to break down the barriers that are being set up around the possible extrapolation of that. So I've said my piece.
Thank you, Duncan. I love how you challenge our perspectives all the time. Leah, you've got your hand up. Welcome.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I would agree with Duncan, and I think it's important to also think about aligning, voting structures with incentivization and which group is incentivized by what. And I think Duncan's proposal kind of maybe is aiming at that. So that sort of resonated with me. I think, because investors are incentivized very differently to people who are using the pay to rely model, to people who are producing the advice, to broader community of impressionists who are a stakeholder but don't have a monetary, incentive in any shape or form, and just want to hang around and see what's going on. So that's kind of my 2 cents worth.
Love it. All right. Well, Andrew, do we need to report back to you on time and next steps? How are we going?
We've got 6 minutes, Joni, to the next piece. But I'd like to thank Greg for giving us the access for our template that we will be doing as the next piece, because we've actually got as a starting point 5 broad brush core member classes for our matrix, and we'll set up the template so we can add more and individuals can add more. But just to look at what we've just been through, we've covered investors, we've covered issuers, products and contributions, governance, consumer and impressionists. So we've got a good start of 5 core areas to work from, and I'd encourage everybody to think of more, and particularly how the interactions start to work between each of the different classes and the broader community, because that will be one of the key points in terms of how we then break down the obligations, liabilities, etc., etc. But 6 minutes more of discussion, Joni.
All right, well then I'm going to
Who are you going to pick on?
I'm going to pick on David if you're in a position to speak. Perhaps not. All right, well, I'm moving on. Will, I know you're from the multilateral fold, but I would love to hear from you.
The only thing I'd add is that, and this will be a discussion for next week, is the dynamic attribution and allocation system is specifically called a dynamic attribution and allocation system because, and we spoke before about competing interests, and that there will need to be an ongoing dynamic conflict of interest registry of types. And I can foresee that even though things will dynamically change over the lifespan of this organization, that there will be a revisiting of laws, rights, obligations, benefits for each of these member classes, possibly based on, during the onboarding process of a new member, based on the matrix of conflicts that they have entering into that organization, and how that may influence or affect the existing investor class, the existing consumer class, et cetera, et cetera. So just another element, but I'm not worried about complexity, because on the one hand, if we're smart enough, the smarter AIs will be able to deal with a lot of that complexity that we don't want to handle. It's not going to be perfect, and we need to keep our eyes on it, but that's something just to remember too, is that the cavalry is coming. Hopefully they're not a bad cavalry, but the cavalry is coming.
Nice note. And I mean, I think everybody's had a chance to talk, but please put your hand up if I have missed you, or if you'd like to make another point. Alex, I know you were responding to other things, but did you have any other thoughts as to, you know, voting rights versus to member classes versus contributions, you know, coming from your insurance background and what an insurer is going to look at and cover? Any initial reactions from you?
Yeah, so the initial reaction is an insurer is going to want to wait to see what advice has been given, what it could be used for, what the consequences might be, and then how it's provided. So in terms of designing that to minimize the exposure, you just want to have the best quality decisions possible being made, and no decisions being made that are going to lead to, you know, extreme, unexpected, costly, whatever type outcome. So, you know, it's very hard to comment without sort of breaking it down. So I think if the design is done in such a way that it's clear and it's limited and it can be communicated, it won't take, I mean, education, every time I've had a conversation with someone in blockchain, Web3, this, that, whatever else, the first bit is trying to get everyone up to speed in terms of, what do you mean smart contracts, this, that, well, what are they going to do? How's it going to work? And so to bring someone in the insurance industry, and even if there was one specialist person that understood it, they'd be the only market. So it needs to be a broad enough market that, you know, everyone's got enough of their stuff. And traditionally that only starts with it, A, being a big enough market for people to pay attention to, and B, to have the education in place to help them understand it, and C, design it in such a way that it can be explained, instead of going, well, we don't know how it works, or we never thought about that when it was put together. Is that Is that sort of?
Yeah, that's really useful, and that's why even when we started LawFi DAO, we've tried to go baby steps and explain it by reference to what at least Australian regulators are familiar with. So, and it's imperfect, but trying to draw those analogies, and they're imperfect analogies, is one step, and then trying our hearts out to explain why there's differences and the new risks introduced by the differences, or the guarantees that the technology provides, such that you don't need auditing or you don't need financial reports for the kind of a financial accountability that we've needed through those opaque organizations. It is an ongoing exercise. So LawFi DAO is still very much an experiment, and I think we have weeded out most of the collective disciplines on this call. The only one we're probably missing is that accounting perspective. So I think we'll probably have to circle back with that next week.
Yeah. The other thing to remember is there's some underlying assumptions. Will's hinted to one of them, which is AI. I mean, we are designing all of this with the knowledge that artificial intelligence will be a factor in the very near future. And that actually impacts the second thing, which I'd want to say is an underlying assumption across the board, which is evidence-based compliance. Okay, we're doing all this in a digital environment, where digital environment can create audit trails. Audit trails can be interrogated. So I think one of the things you look at, I mean, it might not be available for the MVP, but a design consideration, and I think this goes a bit to Greg, good design in terms, it has to be good design, but assuming the good design is in place, then we also have to provide the operational transparency with the evidenced audit trail of decisions made and actions done. So that you've got both. In a DAO environment, you have, guarantee you've got the underlying evidence, and it's now reliant on the DAO collectively selecting and promoting good design.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your honesty and your participation. Great discussion.
Great. So just to close off in terms of the post-workshop assignment for this week, we will be putting together a template, a one-pager, that we distribute, probably go out on Monday, I think now, to everybody, that gives everybody the opportunity to think and reflect on today's discussion and start looking at those broad brush core categories of membership, plus any others that you might that come to mind, and starting to just lay out some high-level dot points about what do you see the rights and the benefits of those particular classes. What do you see as the obligations and liabilities, and where does attribution sit in all that mix? So there's a great deal of consideration around that, obviously, and insight to come in, but also think about it from the point of view of where you might personally like to contribute, and where you can get involved in those sorts of things, and also think of the membership classes as being multi-dimensional in terms of you can be in more than one. So as an individual or a whatever entity comes into this going down the track, you can be in more than one place. And as Duncan laid out earlier on, your profile, which you'd only do once, but you'd be able to access different pieces of this profile for the individual applications within a member class. What does that enable you to do, and how do you want to do it? Okay, so I think that brings us to a close, Janie. Hand over to you to wrap up.
Yes, sure. And thank you very much, Andrew, and the Multilateral team again, and to all of you for participating and making the time today. Time is our most precious resource. Some would argue attention, but you need time to give attention. So I will send the follow-up email on Monday when those post-workshop materials are ready, but the recording will likely be available on YouTube later today if you want to watch anything back or share it with your networks. So thank you again. Enjoy the weekend, rest, reflect, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks, everyone.
See you all.